Okay, so welcome everybody. This is our first attempt at a High Council meeting for all of the patrons who are paying $50 a month and higher.
Yay.
And these are sort of like the super fans who some have been giving for quite some time and are really excited about seeing the project get off the ground. And so we wanted to give them special access to the developers, and also to give them a chance to express what they'd like to see most with the game, ask questions about the development process and things of that nature. And so we'll probably talk for, I don't know, hopefully an hour or longer and get some feedback from all of the High Council members who could be with us today. So first, we were talking a little bit before the stream about some interesting questions, Captain. So the captain, I believe, is our first High Councilman who when we were first just basically hatching the concept of Songs of the Eons, he was the first guy to actually sign on as a High Councilman. Been supporting us ever since. And kind of just been sort of like, I guess what you would call like an angel investor. You just kind of were always contributing, but busy with work, and so it couldn't really follow the streams or stuff like that. So I'm glad to be able to reconnect with you now and get your perspective. And so I'll hand the floor over to you for a second to either ask your questions or say what you will.
Well, so first I would say that it looks like things are going really well. You know, like you said, I haven't been able to follow the project as closely as I would have liked because of other things going on in my life. But like, just looking at the state of the project now, I'm very impressed. You know, it's come a long way. And I guess you wanted me to. So before we actually started the stream, we were kind of joking about things not to say on the stream, and it brought up what actually, I think, ironically, is kind of an actual legitimate question, which is, so there's going to be all kinds of different races and cultures and such that exist in the various worlds that Songs of the Eons is going to create. And it kind of naturally gives rise to this question of what happens when radically opposed races or cultures or groups end up in a situation where one of them is dominant over the other, like one has conquered the other. What would the natural mechanisms involving those pops and how they interplay be? Is it just going to be a straight up kind of, you know, well, one side gradually gets, you know, pushed out, or is there some kind of, you know, if there's enough of those populations cohabiting, is there a chance that there's some other outcome that happens? I'm just curious as to how this could interplay and what your thoughts are in this.
Right. Yeah, and in the question for people, you know, for anyone, most of you who basically weren't in our discussion earlier, we were saying, okay, let's make sure we don't start out the conversation with controversial things and like genocide. And then we're like, wait a minute, actually genocide, that's actually that's a very interesting thing to discuss, you know. And like ideally, I know all the developers, we don't want to turn this game into sort of like an antisocial fantasy, just like, you know, oh, I'm going to go ahead and massacre an entire society just because it feels good or something. But like genocides did happen in history, and it's also important though to recognize that most of the time it didn't happen in history. When someone had the chance to, you know, a conqueror had the chance to, oftentimes they didn't. And so, you know, the question of why they happened and why they didn't happen are both extremely important questions. And I think we need both of those things represented in Songs of the Eons, you know. And I think really, to bring it back to your question about culture, like I think it was always in history way easier to commit genocides when a culture was different than yours, because it was harder to see yourself in the other culture. And that's why so often, like, you have steppe people, you know, like the Mongols or Tamerlane, you know, committing genocides more casually because the people they were conquering were so different than themselves. They were these horse people who were roaming around and had their own standards and morals and things like that. And they were conquering these settled people who were so different from them. And I think that's I think that's definitely a major reason. But I think we also have to look at the reasons for why like genocides oftentimes didn't happen. They most frequently didn't happen when I think you were conquering people that were familiar or part of your own culture. And a big reason I think for that is that it was easier. First off, it was easier to sort of feel sympathy, but also, this sounds terrible, it's easier to exploit them when you understand them better and you're able to interact better and to sort of be able to give them instructions on how to serve you, and you're more easily able to administer those people because you understand them. And so I think oftentimes like, a genocide wouldn't happen too because you have way more to gain out of just simply subjugating these people and sort of like extorting tribute out of them. And you see, even in cases like with Tamerlane, the intention wasn't to commit genocide initially, and it was only after numerous revolts and frustration that the massacres tended to happen in a lot more severely. Even the Mongols conquering China, they they were you can actually read about how a lot of the Khans were contemplating, like, should we just turn China into like a big pasture for all our horses? And then they would start to be like, you know what? Wait, we can just like put like our guy on top of the bureaucracy that's already there, and then they'll like give us these things called taxes, and then we can use these taxes to get like silk and yummy food, and so they opted out of genocide. Even though there was obviously a lot of violence during the conquest, they opted out of just flagrant genocide in the end because there was just so much more to gain from subjugation. Does that kind of answer the question? So we kind of would theoretically want to follow that model in Songs of the Eons, like a culture sweeps in and conquers someone, and whether a genocide occurs, I think, depends a lot on the history of the two people and how often they've been fighting, but also just on whether like the cost of genocide is higher than the cost of just subjugation,
Whether the perceived benefit of taxes is higher than the perceived benefit of a pyramid of skulls.
Right, exactly, right. And a lot of the time, like in the case of Tamerlane, like the pyramid of skulls, like that existed as a means to deter those with heads still on their necks from revolting again,
Exactly.
And so it was still, the end goal was like, oh, you can't give me your surpluses to make me richer if you're dead, right? And so the 20th century Nazi genocide, because we think you're vermin type of concept, I think is probably a relatively new concept, like genocide for the sake of just like killing people because you don't like them, I don't know, and this is just me sort of BSing, but my suspicion is that earlier people would actually be more pragmatic and not be as sort of philosophically driven to commit genocide as some of the crazier 20th century philosophies. But what do you think?
So like, would the player have the direction in this, or like with the simulator decide whether or not the genocide
It would depend. Like, so for instance, I would imagine opportunities opening up to the player. So so for instance, if you have a righteous culture that finds massacring civilians to be this terrible thing, and you're on military campaign and you conquer a city and you decide to massacre everyone, then I would expect there to be like crazy consequences for you doing that, Whereas if you are a very warlike people and you don't have a terrible amount of value for human lives, or you're extremely xenophobic and you're conquering another race or something, I can see
Knowles.
If you're conquering vermin or something, I could see where it would be far easier to get away with that, But consider too, like, genocide has severe consequences for power projection. If you massacre a bunch of people on the way to conquering other people, you're destroying all of the infrastructure, all of the resources necessary to get to places. You're damaging commerce. There's a lot of negative consequences to genocide. beyond just not being able to tax someone. It's kind of, so there's a lot of other reasons not to commit genocide too. But go ahead.
Dead people don't make any crops for you.
Exactly. So when your armies are passing through, you can't feed them, right? So yeah, that's a good way to put it. But yeah, I mean, I guess the idea is that the option would frequently be open to commit these atrocities. I would expect in most cases like straight out systematic, well planned genocide would be just way less common than an army that's pissed off at having to siege a city for 10 months and then going on a rampage because they're frustrated. Think Baghdad, right? Or you're setting an example or something like that. So these atrocities I would expect to be like way more targeted and way less of the kind of systematic extermination that Nazis committed.
So that actually kind of, if I can, that actually raises an interesting question. So something like that, right? Like say you as a player go in and your army decides that it's just had enough. It's sieged a city for 10 months or whatever. It's really angry, and maybe you choose to rampage through the city. Maybe the army does it on its own. Maybe there's some kind of interplay there. But if the idea of that is to convince other cities, hey, don't do this, do you think that would be represented by AI reactions, by there being events in the world that represent other cities saying, hey, these guys just totally annihilated another city, maybe we're not going to be as resistant to a siege?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so that's sort of the magic that we're hoping for with the agent-based model, right? So you can have other agents in the world. So you have agents in your own army who might be pressuring you to commit these atrocities, right? And keep in mind, sometimes this violence occurs as a side effect of just rampant looting and pillaging, too. And so you could have agents within your army pressuring you to do it, but then also agents out in the world that are reacting. And so code-wise, you could set a campaign for your army to march through this river area, and they come to the first city, it refuses to surrender, you burn it to the ground. So then when you show up at the next city, the agent who controls the city, the governor, then evaluates like your reputation on this campaign, and then like has to make a decision. Oh shit, do we surrender, or do we fight it out and then probably face the fate of that last city that was upstream, right? So ideally, yeah, we should be able to achieve that, but
whereas it probably works the other way too, right? Like if you go to the first city and they surrender and you still burn the place to the ground,
then they're like,
the next city's like, well, there's nothing to lose by fighting here.
Right. Yeah, it's just, it's a question, it's sort of ends up kind of becoming a programming question in a way, because, we have to ask ourselves, how exactly do we have this decision-making take place without, melting people's computers? And so I can kind of imagine how, military-wise, when you start a military campaign and you have a course for the campaigning season, you would have some variables kept in your army that initially the variable would be set based on like your culture and your society's reputation in warfare, and then you would have a reputation during that campaign that kind of adds to that. And depending on the atrocities you commit, and depending on whether you've kept your word at a given city or whatever, then any other city in the path of that campaign that you're on then can evaluate how to deal with you based on the reputation you've built. Right. So I think that's doable for sure. And the idea with warfare too is, like in games like just about every game, strategy game, like units move around way too fluidly and turn on a dime, and regiments, it just doesn't happen in a real military campaign. And so in Songs of the Eons, it's more like you're planning almost like a D&D adventure, or you're going into the darkest dungeon or something, where you have to plan ahead of time what you're going to do, the food that you expect to have along the way, any logistics. And so it's almost like this self-contained adventure that you can kind of store as a variable. Let me unplug my going apparently. Hopefully this records properly, otherwise yeah, that's gonna suck. But alright, anyway. So yeah, I guess that kind of answers the question, right?
Yes, sir.
Cool. So there's a lot of negative consequences of genocide, quote of the day. Yeah, so I think we've covered genocide, right? Sufficiently. So I guess let's move on maybe to, let's see, typical name. Typical name is another one of our patrons. Yeah, I know you're in here talking, so if you'd like to ask a question, then I'd be happy to answer it.
So one thing I haven't heard a whole lot about is how will science and research work in this game? Like, I'm guessing it's not going to be like Civilization style, where you like get science points and pick text to research and go along a tree. I remember you guys saying that like research could progress backwards if like your society collapsed or something. So I wanted to know like more about how those mechanics worked. And also, if applicable, like how science would interact with magic. Because I remember there being optional magic in the systems in the game.
Yeah, so the technological angle, we'll go with that first. As always, like we want to try and replicate what you see in the real world as opposed to what you would normally see just in a strategy game. And so there's a couple of components there to unpack. The first is that I would just say the idea is you're as in the real world for most of history, the government isn't, the centralized government isn't managing, scientific research. In most cases, they're not, except maybe when it comes to the military, they're not intentionally trying to come up with new innovations and things like that. And instead what you have is government, the way that governments typically contribute to science and research and discovery is they create an environment that is favorable to innovation and invention. And so, a great example is the Islamic Golden Age and the House of Wisdom, right? So you have a ruler who has some surpluses in society, has a lot of resources to spend, and so rather than sending a bunch of more armies off to conquer things, they decide to create a big library or to create a school of scholarship, or they try to attract scholars from abroad or philosophers and bureaucrats from abroad, and in this way create a more favorable environment for innovation. And then of course you have other ways to sort of expand technology in your society by connecting your society with other societies and bringing in their inventions and their ideas to spread. And the idea, though, is generally that in most places in the world, so you might have a great empire along this river valley here with a magnificent capital, by the lake down here or something, but in most other places will likely be receiving technology as opposed to generating a lot of it on their own. And so the idea is that you'll have some crucibles of innovation where you see a lot of invention done at a particular time during a golden age, and then it'll kind of diffuse across the world. It'll follow trade routes, it'll follow cultural boundaries and things like that. So, if you have an Athens type city-state and a bunch of, so like in this area of the world, if you have an Athens type city-state up in here, and then you have a bunch of other city-states that are of the same culture, then that technology would be transmitted outward from the big metropole to the other smaller cities, and they may have some of their own little innovations that they transmit back, but they would tend to follow a cultural boundary or follow other connectivity type of things. So they'll if you build a big road through this mountain or something, then technology would have a chance to flow back and forth. by opening up routes of communication, if that makes sense.
How much control does the player have over all this?
Yeah, so it depends on whether you as the ruler, I think, want to make a point out of. So, the idea is we want you as the ruler have a certain amount of time in your day, right? And you don't necessarily have mana points like in Europa Universalis where you click somewhere and then you make a bunch of people grow or something like that. But you have a certain amount of time to address particular issues. And so if you want to spend your time organizing military campaigns, that improves your performance in conquest. If you want to spend your time trying to promote the growth of a library or to chase after a particular pet project like Greek fire for your ships or something, that kind of thing actually did happen in history, and you did actually have rulers who were explicitly interested in science and new innovations. And so, in most cases, governments are setting the foundation for technological innovation. But if you want to take a direct role in discovery, then you can do that, but it's going to come at the cost of whatever else you might be doing with your time in the world, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, another thing to consider too is that technology isn't just going to be an issue of invention. It also will involve cultural knowledge as well. So, for instance, cultures, their sophistication will often be the result of how much surplus is in your society and how much time you can free up in people's lives to contemplate questions of philosophy and science, as opposed to just spending all their time trying to survive and produce enough for their families to eat. And so, another way that you as a ruler try to create a lot of innovation is you want to try and actually create a culture which has enough surpluses to spend time thinking about these questions. And that can either be improving the economy, or it can be a matter of shaking down neighbors for tribute so that you can buy food. So, think Athens, right? Everyone is always sort of like admires Athens for their these group of citizens that they have that could spend all day kind of philosophizing and fighting and things like that, fighting enemies and stuff like that. A lot of the reason they could do that is because they had slaves and they had tributaries who basically were able to support them while they did all of their thinking type activities. And so that would be another example of a way to kind of create an advanced society with more advanced technology, aside from just improving your economy and the amount of surpluses your society furnishes you. Makes sense?
Yeah. The other question I had was like, how does science interact with magic in this universe? Like, is this a universe where like the presence of magic will cause technological devices to break, or will we be making magitech devices?
I think, and this kind of gets, Calandial. This is something Calandial and I have talked a lot about, and this is still up. None of this is in stone yet, but I don't think technology will explicitly malfunction magic or the other way around. But the point is, there's only so much bandwidth your culture has. There's only so much free thought in the minds of your people to go around. And so, a culture can't be great at everything. It can't simultaneously be super scientific and also simultaneously have the time to master magic necessarily. And so it's kind of like you can have a fusion culture which leans on magic and advanced technology. But there's, a certain degree of limitation just by what can fit inside people's heads. One thing to consider about magic is that it's not meant to just be a perfect alternative to technology. And so it's like we probably don't really want many situations where you have a perfect magical alternative to the iron plow, right? Instead, we want magic to be of a different nature, more awe-inspiring, more, in some cases, possibly more blunt, but more powerful. And so that way, you don't just go for the same strategy using interchangeably magic or technology, right? We'd like them to be conspicuously different in their utility. Any follow-ups?
Can't really think of anything at the moment.
Okay, well, if you have another follow-up, let me know. I'll move on to Strung, who's been waiting patiently. So Strung, just in case you can't hear me, I'm going to go ahead and ask in Discord. I'm sort of juggling between 3 screens at the moment. Hey Strung, got a question? And I see him typing, so hopefully. Yeah, I mean, even if it's not pre-prepped Strung, you'll have questions for your next part. Even if it's just off the top of your head, even if it's just off the top of your head, you can. You'll be embarrassed or anything. Or if something pops up in your head, go ahead and interrupt us. And I'll answer smiley face. Okay. So while Strung is thinking of something, does anyone else want to interject with any of their other questions? Captain, I know you had more than one. And your questions are pretty sure I know what they are, but I think they're pretty good. Go ahead.
Well, I had other questions prepared, sir, but I did want to make sure that if anyone else had any questions, of course, they,
Sure. We'll deviate if Strung interjects. But go ahead.
So this kind of does, I think, actually tie into the last question, which is, and this is a question I wrote down ahead of time, which is, will cultures organically develop biome-derived adaptations based on where they arise? If they shift to a new biome, how long does it take to adjust? And are some adaptations, even if now maladaptive, shall we say, sticky? Or
right,
just because a behavior is no longer necessarily good for you, as we see in real life with people and cultures, sometimes once you've adapted or learned a certain way, your culture is like, well, this is just the way we are now.
Right. That's a really good question. It was actually, I was thinking about this just the other day, right? One of the best examples, I think, is the Norse colonies in Greenland, right? So for those of you who aren't familiar, basically you had some Viking colonists who colonized the fjords of Greenland. And they brought with them the cultural adaptations of Europe, more or less, right? A grazing culture for their cows and farming culture. And it was reasonably successful for a time while the climate was favorable. But when the climate shifted, there were like all of these marine mammals they could hunt, all of these fish they could fish for, all of these resources that if they had just kind of deviated from their cultural norms, they could have acquired, but they didn't, And it goes with that stickiness that you're talking about, Captain, where they could have basically looked at the Inuit who were living in the area, who were eating lots of seals and were eating lots of fish. And the Vikings could have basically taken on those cultural adaptations and survived, but they didn't. They just stuck with their ways, even as their lifestyle became less and less favorable. And so, I mean, that's going to be an issue of balance. I think what we want in cultures is to also have also have some features in cultures which, like a slider, right? Like, is your culture naturally disposed toward traditionalism? Is it naturally disposed toward innovation and trying new things? And so you can have some cultures that are more likely to, like in the case of the Norse, look at the Inuit and say, oh, hey, maybe we should like do this thing that's different because we're dying, right? I think when a culture is failing, normally that would be the most likely scenario where people decide to try new things. But I think also a culture itself could be entrenched in traditionalism and be unable to change. The flip side, of course, is that if your culture is super duper innovative, they could end up trying out really terrible ideas and then ruining their society, right? And so, like, I don't want to give the impression that just a society being conservative is bad. Like, being traditional is good when what you're doing is working. You know, being traditional is bad when what you're doing isn't working. But it's not always easy to identify what is and isn't working, right? And so, to summarize the answer to your question, I think cultures themselves can have specific dispositions toward innovation and traditionalism, which itself can change over time. But then also the circumstance will influence whether a culture is willing to change its norms, right? Particularly when things are going catastrophically wrong. I mean, that's why, Christianity too faced a crisis, during the early medieval, and you had all kinds of cults and stuff like that popping up, and at times in history you've had suicide cults popping up and trying to do things differently when things are bad, Like during the Black Death, you had this kind of interesting dynamic going too. But okay, so I'm gonna. I guess is there any follow up on that, Captain?
Well, I guess the other part is that so cultures will on kind of inherently build a set of behavioral patterns based on their initial arising biomes. Then
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
And so that'll dispose them to a particular direction. And I think whether a culture is suffering setbacks or doing well will pretty heavily influence whether they decide to change things. So, for instance, you have a tundra adapted tribalistic people move into a floodplain or something. They may want to keep hunting some of the big game that are in the area. If that doesn't work, then more of them might start saying, hey, you know what, we should really try out this other lifestyle because what we're doing isn't working. And then you'd kind of see them unsticky from their previous ways and start to drift toward that type of culture. So yeah, I'm going to pop over this to Strung Out. He's got a question. Discuss this among yourselves. How will Songs of the Aeons treat the Endgame? If magic is a renewable but still depletable resource spread among the landscape, will the higher population of early modern Napoleonic era civilizations mean that magic is sparse and weak, more of a reliance on technology that doesn't rely on magic? How will the game run forever without civilization reaching its ultimate industrial revolution? Yeah, so this is the problem that we've been trying to grapple with. So, I guess in case anyone's going to watch this on YouTube and not really be familiar with SotE, we want Songs of the Aeons to last indefinitely. Theoretically, we want the world to last forever, and setbacks will occur in the world that will knock civilizations backward, possibly lose technology, lose cultural knowledge, and things like that. And the idea is the world just kind of churns on endlessly because cataclysmic disasters will be more common in SotE than the real world. And so the question is, once you get toward the Industrial Revolution, how do you, for a game that will last thousands of years in pre-industrial times, how do you sort of deal with the fact that you can get up toward the Napoleonic era, and obviously there's programming limitations, there's development time limitations and things like that, and trying to model in, we as the developers trying to model in stuff like the Industrial Revolution and modern technology, suddenly our job just got 2 or 3 times bigger. And it's not plausible. So we have this kind of soft cutoff point where we kind of prevent the player from getting to the Industrial Revolution. And so we had a couple ideas. None of this is set in stone, and it's still kind of something that developers debate about too. But first off, you have things leading up to the Industrial Revolution. More will go wrong than happened in real history. You'll have undead invasions and demon asteroids hitting the planet and toppling civilizations and stuff like that. So you got more stuff that's going wrong, right? But then we also will likely try to find a way in which the natural resources associated with the Industrial Revolution aren't as available, or are not as, or are just as available on the surface but not as abundance, or it's of poor quality. We basically need to find a way in which we would flatten out the gains made by the Industrial Revolution so that you gain them slowly on the same trajectory as you gain technology during the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, etc. Right? And so, I mean, that's a really tricky question that even modern historians would have a really hard time projecting or figuring out. Okay, what if the Industrial Revolution didn't happen? Like, what would technological advancements look like? Would windmills and water wheels just get more and more complex to be used for mechanical energy? Would you? Yeah, it's difficult, but that's one of the things. Like, if people want to come into our Songs of the Eons channel and spitball with us on how to tackle this problem, then you're more than welcome to do so. I mean, when it comes to magic, it'll be way easier to just tune and balance the advancement of magic going up toward the Napoleonic era, because we can make it whatever the hell we want. But when it comes to that later Industrial Revolution type of stuff, it gets trickier. And I have a feeling there's going to be no answer that's going to be satisfying to everybody completely. But it is something we have to grapple with as developers, because it's just not, unless we tackle it 25 years from now or something, like it's too much work to try to add in the mechanics associated with the Industrial Revolution in the modern era. And it happens so quickly. Okay, so then you have to ask the questions. All right, well, what happens if nothing goes wrong and you go through the Industrial Revolution, and then you're in the space age, and then you're, in 100 years worth of gameplay, now you've got to figure out how to deal with that. It makes me want to shoot myself in the head. So, anyway,
we could just say there's no fossil fuels in any of these planets.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the easy thing to do. And like, a lot of the components of the Industrial Revolution existed before the Industrial Revolution. You had, right, like, I think you mentioned before, Captain, like the Venetian arsenal was like a modern factory, but without the fossil fuels, so it's not like you can't get pretty impressive productivity gains without fossil fuels. It's just not steroids like what fossil fuels furnished. Anyone have anything to add? Yes? No? Maybe? Strong? Any follow-ups? Things like natural gas and coal are used before the Industrial Revolution in other ways. Yeah, that's true. It would be interesting to have those resources to give you less energy per pound or something like that. So it's just more difficult to create something like an efficient railroad or steam engine.
Here's just an idea that I just had. In worlds where magic exists, if fossil fuels exist, those are the remains of previously living things, right?
Right.
So if you're burning large amounts of, say, coal or oil or any other fossil fuel, you are essentially desecrating the remains of long dead things.
That's interesting. I mean, if I understand you correctly, like if the songs of the Aeons world is meant to be like, oh, okay, so intelligent beings existed 10 million, 60 million, 100 million years ago, and every few 100,000 years you have civilizations arise and do their thing, then it's kind of logical, don't you think, that you kind of use up most of the fossil fuels? Like, or, there would never be a point where it had 60 million years to build up. Like, you'd have some of it, but you'd have some of it replenished, but most of it would just always be in a state of mostly used up, right?
Right, but I'm sorry, I kind of cut out there because my computer did a thing. But yeah, like what Miss Callendale just said on the Discord, if you're burning a lot of fossil fuels, I mean, what happens if you burn the wrong piece of coal and suddenly the undead spirit of an elder god decides, to rise up and smite you because you're desecrating the remains of, whatever. Like, your basic, if magic exists, then using fossil fuels is really, really nasty necromancy.
Basically that's an interesting point. That would be a good point. I guess the one thing I worry about is if you make the use of endgame technology guaranteed to be extremely dangerous, well, it stops the player from just like resisting using it, and then just they keep playing, And so I can imagine a situation where that would be a potential outcome, and when you couple it with the reduction in frequency of fossil fuels, you can flatten out the Industrial Revolution enough, and then have enough possible things go wrong during that time, from both like the sources you're discussing now, but also others, that you basically can plausibly prevent the player from just bumping up against the end of the game and being stuck there.
Right, and even if the player isn't doing it, like, let's say you have some hyper-developed civilization somewhere in the world that decides, hey, we're just gonna try and jumpstart our way into fossil fuels, and it could trigger like some kind of global crisis.
Oh, right. Yeah. So then the player would have to be like, no, you guys over here. They got in their ships, and then they sail across the ocean. Bam, 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 no more coal.
The ancient Vikings have to go raid the hyper-advanced whatever people to prevent them from bringing upon the wrath of the ancient gods.
Right, yeah. I mean, yeah, then that could produce some interesting gameplay too. But I guess the idea is, I'd want to make sure that the player, that it's just safe enough that the player thinks they're gonna get away with it this time,
Maybe this time it'll be different.
Maybe this time the undead gods. Oh fuck! Okay, famous last words. Maybe this time. Yeah.
I think one thing with the sort of Napoleonic thing, like if the Industrial Revolution is sort of causing this big catastrophe, is that once you're sort of in the 1700s, you can't really stop your like smart people kind of from continuing your trend, because you're on a trend at that point,
It's true. It might end up being that you basically have to be a stuck in the mud reactionary type of leader that your people are just like, what's wrong with you, man? You're delaying, you're standing in the way of progress, And so yeah, there could be, it could be that people do whatever the hell they want in your society, and you have to be really repressive to get them to stop. And so that then makes you less competitive against other societies and makes it more likely that you're vulnerable to their advances. So yeah, that's a good point too, I think.
Can your more traditionalist, stick in the mud society survive long enough for the upstart, we want to invent new stuff, people to destroy themselves before they kill you?
Right, and I mean the idea is no matter how strong your society is, you can only project, your culture and your military power over so much distance. And so can you be everywhere at once, kind of controlling everything before telephones or telegraphs and stuff like that, and before super advanced logistics? And so the answer is probably no. So the answer is, you probably won't be able to. Because, Songs of the Aeons, you guys probably know, but anyone who's watching who doesn't know, we want to have a lot of limitations on empire building based on the kinds of limitations you saw in the real world, right? The more distant something is from your capital, the more difficult it is to exert control over them. You have lots of self-interested individuals within your society who want to do their own thing. The further they are from you and the more difficult it is to project your power on them, the more likely they're going to see which way the wind is blowing at any given time and try to either gain autonomy for themselves or, get independence from you. So.
And I guess if I can, that ties into my other prepared question, if I may, which is, will the long-term effects of soil erosion and the linked societal impacts of various agricultural systems best suited to different soil conditions be represented, and how so in a rough sense? And will civilizations produce desertification effects as real early farming in non-ideal climates for those methodologies often did, which kind of ties into that, natural limitations on the civilization.
Right. And so that's the thing, yeah. And I guess the answer to all those questions is yes. Like right now, that's what we're actually working on. And so, for instance, we've created a bedrock map mode, and then what we do is we create soil types and soil depth based on local conditions. You can see some of the variables over on the screen here for soil. We'll have things like soil aggregate stability, which determines how quickly soil erosion can occur. And there's going to be this eternal problem in game where a society kind of has the choice between mining its soil and being awesome for a limited period of time, or trying to conserve its soil and its ecology, but be less competitive and more vulnerable to outsiders, right? And so that's another limitation too on sort of the industrial revolution type thing, is that there's a good chance that as you get closer to that point, you can be damaging a lot of the fundamentals of your of the farmlands that's supporting your civilization. And so, for instance, you talked about desertification. We're actually going to have our trees. What's the right way to put it? We're actually going to have evapotranspiration occurring. And so the more trees that exist in a particular area, not only are they preventing soil erosion, but they're also making the local climate more favorable for more trees and things like that. So when you cut them down and destroy them, it then causes the entire climate of the region to then become drier and less favorable. And so that's all going to be in game, and that's all going to be one of some of the ways that can cause civilizations to collapse without them necessarily even being conquered, right? So if you're living up in this river valley nice and safe, and there's this giant empire out here that's just kind of eating everything up, you don't necessarily, to survive, unlike most strategy games, you don't necessarily have to take active measures to topple this empire to protect yourself. You can actually sort of just wait for them to overtax their resources and collapse on their own if you wanted to. And we'll be keeping the various variables responsible for that ecological crisis. That should definitely be a thing. For instance, even destruction of things like wetlands, for instance. So you can see, you can see here are the major river tributaries in the world, and here you have the riparian wetlands as well, that flank the rivers based on where they appear depends on elevation data and how much water is going through, stuff like that. But all these wetlands actually help to retain water and to expand the water table and make the region wetter. But as we all know, some of the most favorable farming locations are directly along rivers, and if in the short term, if you drain those wetlands and plant on them, you get spectacular yields, but it lowers the water table of the entire area and can ultimately cause the area to dry up, and after a few hundred years, it's not as favorable for agriculture. And so if an empire sort of develops in this area and sort of mines their soil and their water supplies to become powerful and project a bunch of power, that all might come crumbling down once the fundamentals of their core territory deteriorates, and then causes enemies from the outside to reevaluate their relationship with that empire. So similar, to what happened to the Romans in Italy after they raped their soils, and at a certain point, I believe, like in the late imperial era, they had like 1/5 the population of the senatorial era, and that was like without any major invasions. They had just completely destroyed the carrying capacity of Italy. So yeah, did I answer the question? Any follow-ups?
So why would a country choose to go along the short-term route? It seems like an obviously terrible long-term decision.
Oh yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of answers to that. So first off, the reason it happened in history oftentimes was because individuals in the society didn't live long enough to notice the effects, right? And so if it takes 400 years to gradually degrade your soils and your water supply and everything, like an individual isn't necessarily gonna know it, and the average person doesn't have a detailed history of like the ecology of the area either, and so sometimes they just don't know it. But then even when they do know it, they often have immediate pressures. Like if you're just a farmer and you're barely feeding your kids and your family, and then the government comes along and says, hey, we want you to spend half of your day terracing your field so that you don't lose your soil because we're worried about 100 years from now. You're like, well, no, we're not going to risk starving just because you care about 100 years from now. We'll do it when things are better in 5 years, then that's when we'll do it. And of course 5 years comes, and then then you have another reason why you can't do it because of proximate pressures, right? A lot of the time when a society is facing outward pressures too, and you're just worried about not having your core land invaded by those horse people, you're not going to be worrying about conserving your soil, because conserving your soil isn't going to matter if you're conquered or dead in 5 years, right? And so I think the type of conservation methods that you would see in game to prevent ecological disaster, those types of measures would occur in pockets of areas with civilizations that don't have much pressure from the outside, or by people who live a really long time, a race that lives a really long time and has a significant incentive to have a sustainable society. So if you're an elf and you live 500 years, like degrading the soil means that that before your life is over, you're not going to have a place to live. And so it makes way more sense to be more conservation oriented than a human who, even if you do know that the soil could be toast in 200 years, well, ain't going to be me, ain't even going to be my grandkids. So, yeah. Any follow-up questions?
How much control does the player have over how much they mine the soil? Like, do the people decide this on their own, or will there be a little slider that the player can control this with?
So I imagine it would be done through legislation and things like that. It would be done through trying to influence the culture. And so, for instance, okay, so you want to make your people better stewards of the land. Well, it turns out there's this minor deity that some of the people warship, and this is like a fertility goddess, and she, is responsible for bringing about bounty, and some of the adherents, but they manure their soils well and they terrace their fields. Okay, so I'm gonna elevate this deity to a state deity, and I'm gonna put out some propaganda to try and get more people to worship her so that they're better stewards of the land. Like, that's one way to do it, right? But then, like, you would probably in that case use your cloud as a ruler. You would make that your pet project. It wouldn't even necessarily take a lot of monetary resources, but it would take a lot of attention from your rulers. Or maybe you can't conquer as many things. Maybe you can't get involved as much in the construction of that port on your main port city. Another way you could do it is you could do it the Incan way and do like a top-down, centralized planning type of approach where you get enough surpluses in society that you can spend those surpluses on a small army of dudes who go around and terrace all of the fields on slopes so that you can make sure that you retain all of the soil. And that would be like another way that you could theoretically do it. You could just, for instance, also do it the Venetian way and just import food from other people so that soil degradation occurs elsewhere, and then meanwhile, your local area is a nice, beautiful verdance. So there's less pressure put on your local environment. Like, you have to consider that, like in Songs of the Eons, there's not a one-to-one sort of cause effect that we want to happen between you doing something and something happening. It's not like a paradox game where it's like, okay, I'm going to press this button, I get plus X%, Sometimes the effects of what you do aren't necessarily entirely known, and so you can come up with some crazy idea as to how you might conspire to conserve your soil or to get a certain effect. And if you're creative, you can find ways other than what I mentioned that are creative in order to conserve your soil. So, for instance, you could just find a way to make it so that the use of the iron plow never happens, right? And people are forced to just manually do drill style agriculture so that they don't disturb the soil and destroy soil aggregates. But anyway, yeah.
Could get super lucky and stumble onto Amazonian soil enrichment tech, or you could decide to go on vast wars of conquest and literally use the bodies of your enemies as fertilizer.
Yeah. Captain's referring to terra preta soils, which is really it's basically if there were elves living anywhere on Earth at any point in history, it would have been the ancient Amazonian civilizations who basically created this super rich soil that got deeper and deeper and deeper with time. It was like almost like the ultimate sustainable civilization, and so there's that approach too, right? We'd like to have means of subsistence that aren't just like tilling the ground with conventional agriculture, right? You can have agroforestry and silviculture and things of that nature as well.
Of course, their downfall was that since they didn't have any domesticated animals, when a European breathed on them, they all died.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's pretty crazy now. Now it's just like the achievement of their civilization is just being mined and sold in Home Depot as potting soil, But yeah. Any other follow-ups on this sort of sustainability question?
No, I just got here, so I didn't know what's going on.
Okay.
I'm assuming you're talking about soil, right?
Yeah, we're talking about soil, yeah.
Another thing. So, like, when we're comparing, like, mining the soil and versus conserving it, how is the conservation foolproof, or will it eventually dry up anyway, just much slower?
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, the extent of your conservation methods, the more conservation methods you have, the longer you'll be delaying the inevitable, I guess. But there probably won't be infinite. It probably won't last you forever. Although, I mean, there's a few cases like Captain's example, the Amazonians, where they literally created soil depth. The Dutch historically were able to increase their soil depth. Certain places that are really low elevation with very little slope and so therefore very little erosion could last relatively indefinitely with some conservation methods. Lost soils, will last a super duper long time. And so I would say, like, most societies that are advanced will employ some degree of soil conservation. Most of the time, it won't be enough. But, the more the merrier. Like, the more you apply, the longer you'll last. And as a ruler, you'll have to face situations where you have some kind of crisis. Your people, like I said before, your people who are very focused on just like not starving today, you're going to be dealing with pressure from them. And in some cases, you might just have to peel back on your conservation methods because there's just too much popular pressure. Because if you don't cave in, they replace you with somebody who does cave in. So it's like sometimes you'll have to give in to the scuzzy politics of reality, right?
And I also think that there can be times when the player will want to go for a short-term solution, because let's say that you are looking at this growing empire to your east, and you don't want them to be able to contend with you, so you go for a more exploitative agricultural method, right? Or you pull back on your conservation methods for say 50 years, and then at the end of that time you march over with a big army. And that's a way that a player could see to not always be trying to be conservationist.
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right. And so and that's the thing, is it could be a better strategy where you quote unquote deregulate and you let people do whatever the hell they want with the land, and you'll have this population boom, because suddenly in the short term you produce so much more food, people are better nourished, you're sort of borrowing from the soil savings account, and then you can have that demographic dividends to help you win against the such and such society who is an existential threat. And so that could even be part of the strategy per se. Or it could just be as simple as taking all of those dudes you had going around terracing fields. Okay, you're in the army now, I'm taking a hoe out of your hand, I'm sticking a sword. It could be a lot of ways that manifests, which you kind of take that short-term approach to deal with a proximate problem as opposed to an ultimate problem. Do we have any other? I guess we can kind of move on. Probably talked about this particular question quite a bit. What other questions do the High Council have?
Can I do a question that was requested by someone, sir?
You could, as long as it's a patron. We don't want to, not kidding.
Well,
two-part question. Are they a patron? And B, how much did they contribute? No, I'm kidding. No, yeah, go ahead.
To be fair, I find this question interesting myself now that I've seen it. The question is, will super volcanoes be in the game? And if so, would their volcanic ash effects on things like soil fertility and environment be replicated in the system?
Yeah, so we already have super volcanoes existing in the world. We already have the variables for them. You can actually see in rock where historically volcanic ash has influenced the soil. And you can actually see where the younger volcanic ash is. So here's a hot spot that was dragged over the surface of the planet. And back here you have the older ash, which has been leached of nutrients. You have the newer eruptions here. And this is sort of the zone of volcanic ash. And so, basically. And there are certain volcanoes that are super duper big. And that would be nice to have one for the super volcanic eruption to be one of the ways that the world gets reset. Screw with the climate, and then suddenly you have all these cultures that are adapted to surviving in specific climates, and they've all been shifted to some other landscape. But the question is basically yes. some of those variables already exist. So I'd say it's about 2/3 in place already. No name strung. Do you guys have any questions still? Looks like Cal hit. Let me block this screen. Let me look over at the Discord. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, if you have any questions that are not necessarily directly related to gameplay too, you can ask them. If it's about, what you'd like to know what we think our progress is going to be. If you have a question about the process of developments or just whatever, it doesn't necessarily have to be specifically related to gameplay stuff. And later on, I'll actually give a recap of what we've worked on recently and what we expect to be done with in the next couple of months. No, nothing.
Nope.
You guys paid $50 a month, and you don't have more.
I think Spence isn't here. He would ask a lot more questions.
Okay. Well, it's funny. It has been like an hour and 15 minutes. How about this? Let me go over what we've done so far in 0.2. Give you guys kind of like inside understanding of where we're at and where we're going. So right now, as you all know, we're going through 0.2. We're more than halfway done with it for sure. I mean, we released like 0.15 a while back, but basically now geology's pretty fixed in place. Glandial's revising climate. One of the more difficult things for me, the thing I was scared of the most was dealing with water bodies. And that's pretty much mostly done. It was way harder than most people would think to sort of create water bodies from all of these various, from just generalized water flow, and then have different tributaries flowing into one another, giving each tributary different values as far as what kind of sediment they're carrying and stuff like that. Soil texture is mostly done. And the idea is what we want to try and do, Glandial and I agreed on recently, is we want to try to get most of the 0.2 systems in place so that the variables exist in tile, but then come back to them later in 0.3 and 0.4 to flesh them out a bit. That way we can get along more quickly toward type of gameplay stuff that will make the project usable to more people. It'll also let us get ecology in sooner, and we can move the project on a bit further. Because one of my issues in particular is I tend to get on a particular feature and then it's never good enough. It's going to be better and better and better, and it's never good enough. And so when I was working on island arcs, I couldn't get the Japans just the way I wanted them. I couldn't get the Alpine collisions just the way I wanted them. And eventually, you just have to be like, okay, it's, at some point it has to be good enough, And so that's kind of where we're at with 0.2 also. I'm like, okay, so there's 50 different kinds of wetlands. We have mangrove swamps. We have riparian swamps. We have riparian marshes. We have bogs. We have, so... And I finally am just like, what? Okay, we're just going to have one kind of wetland for now, and we're going to create them along rivers, and then we're just going to move on and then come back and deal with them later. So, and so, yeah, that's the plan. Is we're going to try and get into 0.3 so that Calandial can start working on pops and the various aspects of civilization. The idea is we're going to try to capture the dynamics of feral civilizations first. And so hopefully in a year or so, maybe even sooner, I'm hoping we'll have some kinds of gameplay with, sort of primitive tribal societies duking it out and trying to exert like hegemony over one another, that kind of thing.
That reminds me of a question. Will the feral versus civilized disposition affect like their disposition towards conservation at all?
Huh. That's a good question. I haven't honestly thought through that relationship. Like, my impression is civilization takes a long time to create. It takes a lot of capital investment, and so it stands to reason that the more civilized you are, the more interested you are in conserving your society. So, for instance, elves tend to employ the most conservation. They're also heavily skewed toward case selection and civilization. So I think there's a relationship there. I think that once you get really far onto the feral side of the equation. By the way, let me pull up some of those infographics real quick, if I can. They're somewhere. I'll talk while I look for it. But yeah, I think once you get really far onto the feral side, I would anticipate that you would just not really be formidable enough to screw up the land so much that you can't use it anymore. Like if you're living sort of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. I mean, there's evidence in history of like mass burnings and things like that, but I can't think of any examples in history where hunter-gatherers permanently degraded the environment. Does anybody else know?
I think you basically have to have agriculture to really screw things up that badly.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's my impression too. So yeah,
although I would speculate that hunter-gatherers through over hunting.
Yeah.
So the ancestors of the Native Americans, when they got here, caused a massive die-off of a lot of large species of animals, which impacted the environment in certain ways.
Right.
It shifted the environment because the ecosystems that those animals helped regulate were no longer as regulated or controlled. But it wasn't nearly as destructive to the whole ecosystem. It was a shift in the ecosystem, but it wasn't like, we're going to desertify an entire country.
Right. And like a lot of the Great Plains too, so most of the high grass prairie likely used to be trees. But yeah, you're right. Hunter-gatherers basically were constantly setting fires. It was part of their strategy. And so through their behavior, they caused a succession toward a different environment. But what's funny is it actually sort of improved the fertility as opposed to the opposite. So I think you're right. Like so feral. It's actually really good that we brought this up. Yeah, because we would expect that feral races could transform the environment, but not necessarily degrade it. Because even if you overhunt, for instance, and you kill the thing that you rely on, like you sort of cull back your own numbers too, because suddenly you can't rely unless you find a substitute or something. But I can't think of any cases where like desertification was caused by non-agricultural, non-pastoral people. Pastoral people through herding can cause all kinds of damage for sure.
Yeah, from my understanding of history, in order to really, really screw up a place, you either have to be farming it or have big herds.
Right.
Otherwise, you can affect the environment, but it's not like... It's more transformative and not like purely just, congratulations, you've made a desert.
Right. Even some forms of early agriculture were pretty tame. So even like early pre-Republic Roman agriculture involved like heavy cultivation of of the land, but they did no tilling, no aggressive tilling. So you'd have a family on like 2 acres, and they would sort of inject seeds into the ground, and then they had lots of land cover. They hybridized their crops in the same plot, and it was actually sustainable for probably possibly indefinitely. And
that's true, sir. But I would counter that, like the earliest farming methods that we have evidence of, which were like the Sumerian ones, basically resulted in mass desertification, deforestation, and salinization, because they didn't realize that using the irrigation systems that they were in the climate that they were gradually resulted in an increase in the level of salts in the ground.
They salinized their fields. I think even in Europe too, you had waves of agriculture in certain places, and I think like the tradition of chopping down trees on your plot and nearby, and then leaving the ground bare during the off season, basically was a recipe for erosion. But if you had an agricultural technique in which you would, in an area, sure, you would chop down the trees, but then you would plant your crops year round or have some kind of crop cover, then it could be pretty tame on the soil. But now that I think about it, I think probably, early agriculture, depending on your method, The plow was what really, like, mass accelerated, like, soil erosion. Are there any other follow-ups on that particular question? I was doing like an overview of where we were going with the project. But so we're trying to get to a reasonable place, and we don't, like, 0.2 has gotten bigger and bigger with sort of, we ended up doing more with it than we intended. And so it's kind of, I guess, taken longer, but it's a lot cooler than we thought before. So there's that trade-off. As far as the development speed goes, it's because we're doing this still in our free time, right? When life gets busy, we kind of can have a dry spell as far as progress with the project. And I'm finding that it's, especially like in my role, I'm supposed to be like managing people and stuff like that. Like, it can be difficult when there's a week or 2 or even 3 where life gets really busy, either with work or with family or whatever. That suddenly, like, you have a choice between, well, do I code or do I engage the community? Do I manage other people to try and get them working on a particular thing? You can't do it all. It can be a lot of pressure sometimes. But the way I see it, like, the thing that's going to allow us to succeed right now is to develop the project on a non-burnout strategy at a non-burnout pace. And if we can get to a plateau where we have a product in the future that can raise more revenue and actually pay people full time, that's the point where it can really take off. Anything else, guys? We've been at it about an hour and a half. So I guess if there's not any more questions, then we can probably start to wrap this up. Or if no one can think of anything else to cover.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure we could sit here talking about stuff all day, but
yeah, well, it's the least I can do. I mean, I'm a bit honestly shocked by how many people volunteered to be high councilmen and contribute so generously to the project. And I know we I'd love to actually do more of these in the future if you guys are up for it. I'd even like to do it on like a monthly basis or something like that. It could be good to reorient and kind of touch base too with, the people who are the kind of people that'll make Songs of the Eons succeed. Like it's still like Songs of the Eons will succeed long term if we can make this into a saleable product, and so we in a way have to make sure that we're serving the people who are willing to shell out the kind of cash that you are. And so you guys have special insight in a way. These sessions are almost like you doing us a favor again. So.
I think maybe for next session we should think more about like how the military aspect of the game will work.
Yeah, I think so. That would be cool, and we can you guys can come up with questions. It's a bit of a ways off, but I think one of the things that could really make Songs of the Eons shine apart from other strategy games is actually to try to capture all of the things involved with warfare that are so often ignored in other games. And usually ignored in other games for a couple of reasons. A, they're serving a more casual audience, but B, and I think the deeper reason, is because they don't have the depth of variables that we have in Songs of the Eons. Like if you want a logistic system, and you want a system by which people live off the land, and soldiers who live off the land and create consequences for the people they're stealing from, you need all of those variables, those granular variables at the farm level, right? And we'll have those variables, so I think it lets us do so much more. But yeah, for sure, we can maybe what we can do is in the Inner Circle channel, No Name, we can have a vote among the High Council on just the next topic you guys want to cover, and maybe we can go on a topic by topic basis, and you guys can ask questions, based on those topics. Okay, so I guess that's it. I might do a little more coding today, possibly on stream, possibly not. We'll see. But thanks. I thought this was fun. I thought this was good. I'm going to go ahead and put it up on YouTube probably in a day or two. I'll edit it a bit. I'm hoping that the sound goes smoothly and that I'm not echoing the entire time. So thanks again. And I will see you guys later. I'll also go ahead and I'll put this up on the video up on Reddit. We can continue the discussion there with a broader audience. So I'll see you guys
have
later.
A good weekend.
See you in Inner Circle.
Bye.
And